The following program presents principles designed to promote good health and is not intended to take the place of personalized professional care. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the speaker. Viewers are encouraged to draw their own conclusions about the information presented.
Hello and welcome to Health for a Lifetime. I'm your host, Don McIntosh, and today we're just delighted that Dr. Nedley's back with us. Welcome, Dr. Nedley.
Thank you, Don. Very good to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about something that's very vital. It's very important. It's the brain.
Yes.
And, details concerning the brain. I understand that recently you've been working on a book that's going to be released, or maybe will be released by the time people see this, about the brain, but more specifically about depression in the brain.
Yes.
And so in this segment, we want to talk a little bit about the brain and what about the brain? What makes it so special?
Well, the brain is actually the most complex structure known to human beings at this time. And when you consider the space shuttle, when you consider all of the structures that are known to man, this 3.5-pound structure is actually more complex than any other structure known at this point in time. It has 100 billion neurons.
100 billion neurons. I don't know how you would picture 100 billion of something.
The neurons are actually the brain cells that do the communication, do the thinking. There's 100 billion of them, and there's even more supporting cells in the brain. And it's just phenomenal when you consider that that's all just encased in 3.5 pounds.
So the DNA that's been, kind of decoded and whatnot, it just pales in comparison to all the different things that need to be decoded to understand the brain.
Yes, it really does. Now, the DNA is there in each one of the neurons, but the amazing thing is most organs in the body have around 10 different types of cells. The brain has thousands of different types of cells.
So your heart would have like 10, maybe 5, 10 different types of cells, but the brain has thousands.
Thousands. And each one of them is different as far as their connections are concerned. And each one of them has an important function to play.
So these 1,000 different types, how do they communicate with each other? How do they get along? How does it work?
Well, the average neuron in the body actually has 1,000 different connections with other neurons. Some neurons, called Purkinje cells, will have 200,000 connections. Just one neuron, 200,000 connections with other neurons.
So that's like going into your house and having 200,000 outlets, but it's all in the size of one cell.
All in the size of one cell.
Wow.
Oh, it is an incredible structure. And then the communication actually occurs where those synapses are, what we call the synapse. That's where one neuron is actually touching, as it were, another. It actually doesn't touch. It comes very close, and it communicates through chemistry from one neuron to another.
Is there any electricity in the brain?
Oh, yes. In fact, that's how this communication takes place, is through electric current. One neuron will fire electricity, and at the end of that electric current, a chemical is released to then make the other neuron know that it's communicated with it.
So the electricity just then triggers a certain type of chemical. It could be different in one case or another. There's different types of chemicals?
There's different types of chemicals. There's well over 1,000 different types of chemicals actually made in the human brain that are going through this communication process.
Amazing. I mean, we're sitting here in a studio that probably, I don't know, it may have maybe 1,000 or 2,000, maybe 3,000 connections. I don't know. We have all these lights around and different things. Haven't counted them up. But that's just one cell, and then that's amplified by, what did you say, 100 billion.
That's right.
What about those different things, those different chemicals? Can you tell us a little bit more about those? So I understand probably a nerve impulse comes down, sort of like a domino chain down one of those. Explain what happens.
Well, it actually goes down the axon. The axon is the long portion of the nerve where the electric current is transmitted. And then that axon then branches out, sometimes hundreds, sometimes 1,000, sometimes more, into the receptacles of the other neurons. And in that synapse area, there's a number of chemicals that can be released. One of the most common is glutamate. Glutamate is a stimulating chemical. And then there are inhibitory chemicals, and then there are modulating chemicals that are very important in that synapse area, or where one neuron is communicating with another.
So glutamate then stimulates. Is that like, what do you call it, an excitotoxin? Or maybe not a toxin, but you know, they have those things that they say if you eat them, they're going to excite your brain or different things.
Yes, this will excite. It actually, since it's stimulating, it's called an excitatory neurotransmitter.
Okay, but it's not a toxin.
It's not a toxin. Now, of course, in excess, it could be a toxin.
Mm-hmm.
And it can actually stimulate the nerve cell so much that it destroys the nerve cell. But we're talking about something that is not a healthy portion.
So when you think or you are excited, your brain then releases glutamate-type substance, or is it the other way around?
Well, actually, the glutamate would produce the excitement.
Okay. And how that all works, we probably don't understand yet, do we?
There's much about the brain we don't understand. We're actually, piece by piece, unfolding more mysteries as the weeks go by.
So what would dopamine be?
Dopamine is actually a modulating chemical. It doesn't stimulate and it doesn't inhibit. It actually modulates. And to illustrate this, glutamate would be playing the flute, providing the air to produce the sound, and the dopamine would be playing the keys. Okay. In order to make the melody of that sound.
It'd be the placement of those. So dopamine, I mean, that's something we normally hear about, and you know, we normally hear that it kind of soothes us and all those different kind of things. And is that correct?
Well, dopamine has a modulating effect. It can have a soothing effect in certain instances, but it can also be very important in regards to motion. Those that don't have enough dopamine end up with Parkinson's disease, and that causes a stiff walking gait, a stooped over gait, and actually a decreased ability for the entire brain to function very well.
So we have some public officials, you know, in government now that have Parkinson's disease. We hear about that from time to time. Mm-hmm. The fluidity of movement and the tremors and whatnot, that's all related to that. But can they still think things through well?
They can think things through pretty well up to a certain point. And then in the later stages of Parkinson's disease, it actually causes dementia, which means an inability to be able to think things through clearly.
So the dopamine then probably is just a pretty big part of the brain. How much of the brain then has that capacity?
You would think it would be a very important aspect of just about every neuron.
Got to have the dope. I mean the dopamine, right?
Actually, only 200,000 neurons produce dopamine.
200,000? I mean, you said there was over 1 billion? That's not very many.
Yeah, 100 billion.
100 billion.
So 200,000 to 100 billion is a very small amount of neurons producing dopamine. But when you consider that each one of those neurons has about 1,000 ways in which it can have that dopamine communicate with another nerve cell, and then those nerve cells have 1,000 ways of communicating with other nerve cells. If you have the dopamine content lowered in those 200,000 cells, it can have almost an entire brain effect as far as its impact.
So even though there's a small amount of cells that produce dopamine, if they don't, they're so well connected that everything comes to a grinding halt, so to speak.
Correct.
Wow, that's sort of like, you know, we study in the Bible and we see the remnant, and we see how important the remnant were throughout the Scripture. The dopamine would probably be sort of like the remnant.
That would be a good illustration. A very small portion, but having a profound effect upon the entire brain.
So are there treatments when we have Parkinson's disease and those different kind of things that they're developing?
Oh, there are treatments, yes. We try to provide more dopamine.
Okay.
And, of course, we can do that through chemistry, providing more dopamine intake. And then part of that dopamine goes to the brain, and then that dopamine can then be used to communicate with one nerve cell. However, that's not all that great a mechanism. It does work. We have ways of trying to get more dopamine in, and even what we call dopamine agonists, which act like dopamine in the nerve cell. But we're just providing it in the neuronal junction without the nerve cell itself producing it and releasing it. And so that gets into some side effects, and that's why all Parkinson's medications can have side effects. If we could get the nerve cell itself to produce it and release it when it's supposed to, we could have a treatment that would have no side effects.
Yeah, so in taking care of some Parkinson's patients, I've noticed that they will be on a certain medication for a certain amount of time, like Sinemet or whatever they use nowadays. I'm not sure, and then they have to go off. They still have to go off of that for a while because they have those reactions. Well, so we have the stimulating, we have the modulating, and then we have the inhibitory. What would be a common inhibitory thing that maybe we've heard of before or that you could explain to us?
Well, there's a relative of glutamate. It's probably not well known that it actually is an inhibitory chemical. There's actually more inhibitory chemicals than there are excitatory chemicals in the brain. The brain is also meant to be have an important function, that being a brake on behavior and a brake on overstimulation. And so there are several inhibitory chemicals to try to prevent glutamate from getting out of control.
So it has a balance of powers. It's just like sort of the government over the system. The brain kind of helps us. It's our legislative branches, so to speak.
Yes, it's very important for there to be a balance in the brain, and a balance in many forms. You know, there are just 3 balances in our government here in the United States. There's a lot more balance taking place in the human brain.
So we've talked about how complex the brain is. We've talked about the different, over 100 billion different types of neurons with over 1,000 connections. Some have 2,000 connections each. We've talked about the different chemicals that are released.
Some with 200,000 connections, actually.
We're going to take a break here in just a minute, but let's introduce something that we want to talk about. This is amazing. The Bible says we're fearfully and wonderfully made, and certainly with the brain that is true. But is there any flexibility? Does it have to work this way or that way? Is the brain pretty much, you know, you take your computer in and you get, here is some rapid access memory, here's some RAM memory, we're just going to put that in, and that's the way it's got to work, and if it's not there, it's not going to work. Does the brain have any flexibility?
Yes, it has a lot of flexibility, and that's really what makes it different from these simple computers that are being used today. I say simple because we look at the new computers and say, wow, how much better, how much more complex they are. But in relationship to the human brain, they are very, very simple structures.
We've been talking with Dr. Neil Nedley, and we've been talking about the amazing brain. We've talked about how complex it is. We've talked about lots of different things about it, but the most interesting thing we've just been mentioning is that there's some flexibility in the brain and that it can do different things. And when we come back, we're going to find out more about those different things, so we hope you join us.
Have you found yourself wishing that you could shed a few pounds? Have you been on a diet for most of your life, but not found anything that will really keep the weight off? If you've answered yes to any of these questions, then we have a solution for you that works. Dr. Hans Diehl and Dr. Eileen Ludington have written a marvelous booklet called Reversing Obesity Naturally, and we'd like to send it to you free of charge. Here's a medically sound approach successfully used by thousands who are able to eat more and lose weight permanently without feeling guilty or hungry through lifestyle medicine. Dr. Diehl and Dr. Ludington have been featured on 3ABN, and in this booklet, they present a sensible approach to eating, nutrition, and lifestyle changes that can help you prevent heart disease, diabetes, and even cancer. Call or write today for your free copy of Reversing Obesity Naturally, and you could be on your way to a healthier, happier you. It's absolutely free of charge, so call her right today.
Welcome back. We've been talking with Dr. Neil Nedley, and we're talking about the brain. You had mentioned something that was fascinating before we left, that the brain really has some flexibility, and that that gives us hope. We don't have to just be, it's an organic organism. It can reposition as to what we need.
Yes, actually, just a thought process itself can actually weaken some associations with other neurons and strengthen other associations with other neurons. And a memory, a thought to produce a memory can actually disconnect a neuron from some other neurons and then actually have that neuron be associated with others. And so we have the ability, so to speak, of having this brain be very flexible. It's not like a computer where it is, where its circuits are there, and the only way you're going to change it is to go in and do surgery on the computer, which would be having your hardware person come in and do things. You can actually have the thoughts themselves change the makeup of the brain.
So that's what unplugs and plugs things back in, and so our thoughts and what we focus on and what we think about is very important.
Very important, particularly when those thoughts become habitual. Habitual thoughts, there are very, we could call them expressways or interstate highways, which are well traveled. And once we get into a habit, we have interstate highways in our brain that are not easily destroyed unless we go a different route and don't travel that highway for a very long time.
So how can we be deliberate about that? As you know, we hear a lot about the different right brain, left brain, all this different kind of things. How can we be deliberate about having a healthy brain?
Well, I'd like to say there's been an overemphasis really on this left brain, right brain things. I hear some individuals and even some scientists talk about this, and there is some truth. The left brain tends to be more objective, the right brain tends to be more creative, but that is an oversimplification of the process. The frontal lobe is to be the control center of the entire brain, whether it's the left or the right brain. And the left side of the frontal lobe and the right side of the frontal lobe have some very similar functions. And to try to simplify the brain by breaking it up into these two sides is really doing a disservice to it.
Doesn't understand the complexity of all those different connections that we talked about.
Exactly.
Okay, so then what I imagine then, do we need to talk anything more about the different lobes of the brain and what they do and talking about complexity of the brain?
Well, there are specialized areas of the brain. The occipital lobe, for instance, the back portion of the human brain, is actually where your vision is centered. But it's much more than just a visual area. It actually takes a look at where things are in space, the color that they are, the hue that is coming in. And also, it's very important in regards to geometric skills and even spatial engineering type skills involve the occipital lobe. So anything to do with spatial orientation, colors, and those type of things would involve the occipital lobe.
So geometry, all those different kind of things. Do you develop, is balance back there too?
Balance is even further back, and it's a little lower. It's in what we call the cerebellum. And this is a very important area, particularly for certain creatures such as monkeys that are very athletic and very smooth, and they're going upside down, swinging by their tail, etc. And our athletes of today have to have well-developed cerebellums in order to be good in their athletic sport.
With all this complexity, I'm sure there could be problems.
Oh, yes. Problems develop. In fact, problems more commonly than you might imagine, Don. Fully 22% of individuals from the time they were born will have a mental illness at some time during their lifetime.
So 22 out of 100 people are going to have what we would call a mental illness. What do you mean by a mental illness?
A mental illness is beyond just feeling blue or just having a personality problem. We are all of us, I would say, and probably 100% of us are going to end up in some problem with our brain itself. But that doesn't mean that we're going to have a mental illness per se. That just means that we got off the right track, and we had problems as far as the brain development and making appropriate decisions, etc. But a mental illness goes beyond that. A mental illness would involve, for instance, major depression, where instead of just feeling sad or empty, we also have a constellation of symptoms that bring about this major depression. We also have schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, affective disorders such as anxiety disorders, which can produce what we call obsessive-compulsive disorders, phobias, or even chronic anxiety in and of itself. These are disease processes of the brain that need special attention. The good news about these diseases, though, Don, is that about 90% of them are actually reversible through finding the cause and getting on the appropriate treatment.
Okay, so you gave us a lot to think about there. 22 out of every 100 people are going to have this at some time in their life, some major depression. Well, let's talk about that. What about major depression? How many of that 22% are going to have the major depression?
10% of individuals will develop major depression.
So that's a biggie.
That's a biggie.
And I know that you're actually writing a new book on that because you
Yes.
see so much of that. We want to talk a little bit more about that. But and then how does it break down after that?
Well, actually, the most common mental illness is chronic anxiety. We'll deal with that as well in our book. And it does have a tie-in to depression. About half of patients with chronic anxiety will end up with depression. And then other common disorders are obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Meaning just a certain routine you can't get away from, or you have to do it this way or else you have a lot of anxiety as a result?
Exactly. And then there are simple phobias. Fear of being in enclosed spaces, for instance.
What about fear of snakes?
No, fear of snakes is not classified as a mental illness.
It's very good to be afraid of snakes. Well, I know that some people watching it today will be very happy that that's not. Okay. So what would be a bad phobia? Like you said, fear of people, would that be considered a mental illness?
Yes, fear of people is actually a classified mental illness where you have fear of actually getting in a group of people, or a fear of even going to a social encounter because of that phobia. Unnatural.
So you said something very encouraging, though, that 90% of these can be reversed. Let's talk about the discouraging first part of that statement, and let's talk about the encouraging next. The discouraging part is that 10% that can't be. What's that 10% that really can't be addressed?
Well, actually 10% in regards to standard ways of looking at this.
Okay.
I actually am more optimistic. I think there's probably a far greater than a 90% chance. If we really take a look at the root cause and try to find the cause of these diseases, I think we'll do a lot better than even 90%. But out of those, that 10% or less, a lot of it has to do with how their brain was formed during the time when it was in the mother's womb.
So some genetic things, some things that come as a result of drug abuse by the parents, those
Correct.
kind of things, where the
Correct.
wiring, 1,000 circuits per cell are just not there.
Correct.
That kind of thing.
Right.
And that's what accounts for that 10%, that it's a little bit more problematic in reversing it without divine intervention, which, of course, God can do anything.
Exactly. And the other thing I would like to bring out is even though you have the genetic basis for mental illness does not mean you're in that 10%. If your mother and father were both depressed, or even if they both committed suicide, that does not mean that you are resigned to get major depression no matter what you do in your lifetime.
And you hear that a lot. A lot of people say, well, they committed suicide, so you must be headed that way. But for the person that's listening today, that's just not true.
No, it's not true. It does make them have a greater tendency. But if they actually get on the proper program, lifestyle-wise and thought process-wise, they can completely avoid the major depression that their parents had.
Does this mean medication? When you say reversing it, does that mean medication in that 90% of the cases that are going to be reversed?
It could mean medication for the short term. In some cases, it might mean medication for the long term. But in dealing with major depression, for instance, we're able to get major depressed patients off of their medication in about 90% of cases and not have a relapse into their depression if we get to the cause and put them on the right lifestyle and nutrition treatment program.
Dr. Nedley, you're a Christian physician. I mean,
Correct.
that's one of the great benefits. And I understand in the medical schools across the country, they now even have, you know, they have all these seminars on spirituality. They're bringing all of this in. And, I think that they don't pick and choose between religions and different things. But as a Christian physician, what have you seen in the research and whatnot that kind of ties this all together in terms of addressing it?
What brings this all together, Don, is where scientists are converging on the area of the brain that tends to bring out all of these mental disorders, and that is the frontal lobe of the brain. The frontal lobe of the brain is now the center of where depression originates from. Before, we used to think it was the emotional area of the brain because depression has so much to do with emotions. But actually, it's due to the control center of the brain having a decrease in circulation and a decrease in activity that brings about depression. I happened to listen to the top bipolar researcher in the United States just a few weeks ago, and he says that bipolar disorder, we are now finding out, is originating in the frontal lobe of the brain. Schizophrenia has to do with the frontal lobe of the brain. And just about every one of these mental illnesses converge on the frontal lobe of the brain, a problem with the control center that then brought about the mental illness. And as a Christian physician, what is meaningful to me here is the frontal lobe is the center of morality, spirituality, and the will. Without the frontal lobe, there is no spiritual person, there is no will. And so this is vitally important to understanding these mental illnesses and treating them.
So in treating this, you know, the 22% of Americans that have mental illness, and you have given us optimistic words that 90 and even more than that percent of them can, 90% or more of them can reverse this. What should they do to build their frontal lobe to either prevent or perhaps reverse these mental illnesses?
Well, in a statement, it would be eating appropriately, drinking appropriately, being on the appropriate lifestyle, and thinking appropriately.
That sounds like a Bible text. Whatsoever you do, you know, whatever you eat,
Whatever you drink,
whatever you do
all to the glory of God.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Nedley, and thank you for joining us. We hope that what you've learned has been a help to you. If you want more information about Dr. Nedley's book, call 3ABN, and we hope you join us next time.